right now, what everybody says is the crisis, is not the crisis. Falling real estate prices, companies going bankrupt, credit being restricted, consumers not spending as much, savings going up. None of this is the problem. All of this are the consequences of the problem. And if people are trying to solve a non-existent problem, if they're dealing with the symptoms and not the disease, they're not going to solve anything. The problem was years of reckless spending and borrowing. And this didn't happen because of some failure of capitalism. Far from it. Capitalism would have prevented all this from happening. This is a failure of government. The problem is not that the bubble burst. The problem is that the Federal Reserve, with cheap money, and Congress, with moral hazard, inflated the bubble in the first place. The fact that it burst is a foregone conclusion. But our politicians who never understood the problems, who didn't understand the crisis, the people who were laughing at me when I tried to point it out, think if we can only get the situation back, if we can only get consumers spending, if we can only get more debt, that somehow we're going to solve this problem. We are in trouble today precisely because we borrow too much money, precisely because we consume too much. The solution is not to do more of that. If you're in a gigantic hole, how do we get out of it? By digging the hole deeper. We're not. The government wants to stimulate the economy, but they don't stimulate the economy. They don't stimulate real production. They don't stimulate capital investment. We're not producing more goods as a result of government stimulus. What they stimulate is bigger government, which stifles the economy. What they stimulate is more reckless borrowing, more consumption, more gambling. Why do we want more of that? That is why we are in trouble. You know, George Bush, he ran on this platform of change. Where's the change here? He said that if you're in a car and you're driving towards a cliff, you should change directions. I agree, we should change directions. The problem is all he did is step on the gas. We don't need more stimulus, right? We are overdosing on stimulus. The stimulus is the problem. It's not the solution. Think back to 2001, 2002, when George Bush was first elected. What happened? We had a recession. Why did we have a recession? Because the government created stock market bubble based on cheap money of Alan Greenspan burst as soon as he got to office. And of course, it was compounded by the events of September 11th, but the economy was going to enter a recession. Rather than allowing the free market to correct the problems in the economy that had developed during the 1990s so that we could have a lasting, sustained recovery, the government decided to stimulate. And how did they stimulate? The Fed slashed interest rates down to 1%. And we cut taxes, increased government spending, and turned a surplus into a deficit, all in the name of stimulus. And what did it get us? The biggest consumption binge in human history. We borrowed trillions and trillions of dollars from people all around the world. And what did we do with the money? We spent it all. It's gone. We built houses that we couldn't afford, and we adorned them with granite and marble and all kinds of consumer electronics. We imported all this stuff that we couldn't afford. And we had this phony economic expansion based on the accumulation of consumer debt and rising asset prices. Well, why did all this happen? It didn't happen because of the free market. It happened because of the government. How is it that we could borrow so much money? Did the free market put interest rates at 1%? No. It was the Federal Reserve that did that. If the market was setting interest rates, they would have been much higher. And what would higher interest rates have done? They would have discouraged borrowing. They would have kept home prices in check. They would have rewarded people for saving their money. So we would have had more savings. We would have had less borrowing. But the government didn't want that. They wanted phony growth so they can get reelected. So they chose to stimulate. And what did the government do? They created all these moral hazards. You know, they're blaming everything on greed. You know, everybody is greedy. I'm greedy. Everyone in this room is greedy. Greed has been here for hundreds of years. Why did this crisis happen now? Why all of a sudden is the greed such a problem? The government wants you to think it's because of sudden deregulation. That's all ridiculous. There was no deregulation. What happened was, or the only deregulation there was, is the deregulation of the free market. It was government manipulation that created the moral hazards that prevented the free market from checking greed. Because greed is always counterbalanced by fear. Everybody who came into this auditorium had to walk through a casino. Why don't you just gamble all of your money there? Why don't you just put down your life savings? After all, you might make a lot of money. Don't you want a lot of money? Don't you want to win big? Why not put it all on black and spin the wheel? Well, the reason you don't do that is because you don't want to lose. Well, if the government told you you couldn't lose, if the government said, well, the losses will be on the taxpayer, we'd all be at the casino right now. There'd be no one listening to me. So it's no surprise that when the government says to lenders, make mortgages to anybody, because the government guarantees it. Right? Is it any surprise when the government guarantees student loans? Don't worry. Don't worry how much they borrow. Don't worry how overpriced the tuitions are, because if the student doesn't pay it back, the government will. You know, once the government is in there, you know, there's a moral hazard. The free market is not allowed to operate. It's short-circuited. And you can't have capitalism without market forces. It doesn't work. Just like you can't have capitalism without failure. You need risk. Companies that are doing it wrong, companies that are losing money, have to fail. We can't prop them up. You know, when a company is losing money, it means that it is not effectively allocating resources. It's taking land, labor, and capital, combining them, and then losing money. We want to put an end to that. We want to bankrupt those companies and free up their resources to somebody else who could do a better job. But what does the government want to do when they see a company that's going bankrupt? They want to prop it up. They want to keep it in business at the taxpayer expense. And so they save a few jobs that are obviously we don't want, because we'd rather reallocate that labor, and in the process they destroy more productive jobs, because in order to prop up these money-losing companies, the government needs revenue. Because the government doesn't have any money. If the government's going to bail out General Motors, where's it going to get the money? It's got to take it from some other company that isn't failing. So we have a kind of reverse Darwinism, an anti-capitalism, where you have the survival of the unfitness. The more you screw up, the bigger your losses, the more money you get from the government. So what are these perverse incentives? Lose money and get rewarded. Make money and get taxed. You know, we cannot run an economy like this. But unfortunately, the government has been able to blame these problems on a lack of regulation. Just like they were able to blame the Great Depression on Herbert Hoover's, you know, staunch belief in free market capitalism and his failure to intervene. This is all revisionist nonsense. The Great Depression was created because Hoover and Roosevelt didn't allow the free market to work. They tried their own versions of bailouts and stimuluses, and so we had a Great Depression. We ultimately got out of it, not because of Roosevelt, but despite Roosevelt. And not because of the Second World War, but despite the Second World War. And the fact of the matter is, the government is now in danger of creating an even worse depression than the one they created in the 1930s. And I think the reason that this depression could be worse and will be an inflationary depression, unlike the one our grandparents had, is because the fundamentals of the economy are even worse. And the government is already enormous. When Roosevelt expanded government, he started with a tiny government. He might have doubled the size, but it was still relatively small compared to the real industrial parts of our economy. Today, the government is already huge, and now it's just becoming off the charts. It's becoming enormous. When Roosevelt, you know, to the extent that we borrowed any money back then, I mean, we had plenty of Americans with savings. We don't have that anymore. We're financing this gigantic growth in government by borrowing money from Japan, by borrowing money from China, by borrowing it from Saudi Arabia. We're borrowing money from all around the world. And we're drowning in a sea of debt. Now, the government's misguided version of economic stimulus is that we got to get the economy going by encouraging more spending, more consumption. The only way to get more consumption is to get more production. See, you can't consume something that isn't produced. So production has to come first. Supply comes before demand. They haven't figured that out. And where does supply come from? It comes from capital investments, because you can't produce goods unless you have the machines to do it. Well, where does the capital come from? It comes from savings, because entrepreneurs can't borrow money that hasn't been saved. So in order to consume more in the future, we have to consume less right now. We have to save more right now. And so if we're going to save more, we have to spend less. Why should the government try to interfere with that process? You know, the government has economics on its head. You know, they think that, you know, the key is creating demand. You know, the basics of economics is that demand is infinite. You know, anybody can see that. I've got a 6-year-old child, right? I don't have to stimulate his demand. He wants everything he sees.